Today is May 4th, 2008. I am Eric Mishnick, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Moorhead, Minnesota. Can you please state your full name for us, please?
Emmanuel Jerger.
And what is your middle name?
Jane.
Okay. When and where were you born?
I was born 1st of June 1925 in Eaton, Colorado.
Okay. Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
Nothing that they discussed. Nothing that I've ever heard.
Okay. Was there a midwife or a doctor present?
Well, they say that's, all of my brothers and sisters were attended with a midwife.
Okay. Could you please share some of your earliest memories with us?
Memories with...
Just some of your earliest memories of your childhood.
Well, I can remember I was about 4 years old when we left Colorado. Folks moved to Scottsbluff, Nebraska from there. That's my first memory of a moving experience. My folks moved a lot. They lived in 7 different states. And I just don't recall a lot of it until I was about 11 years old, 10, 11 years old. I mean, where you'd like to remember, you know. We were living in South Dakota at the time, and that's where I started school. And I started there in 1931 at the American Horse School. And we lived in South Dakota for 7 years during the Depression years. And it was in 1937 when after many crop failures, they moved back to Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Again, it seemed like that was always home base for them. I don't know why, but it just seemed that way. And then they lived there until I lived in Scottsbluff until 1916, and then they moved to Hardin, Montana. And it was during the World I era, and that's when I think that they lived there about 4 years, because they moved. As the story is told, they moved from there to Colorado, and that's where I was born in 1925. But getting back to 1937, when we left there in South Dakota, we moved back to Nebraska. And we lived there for 3 years, I think it is, from 1937 until 39. And I started high school my freshman year in Gering High, Gering, Nebraska, which is just across the river from Scottsbluff. And then they moved again, this time to Minnesota. And that was in 1940, in the spring of 40. And then I finished my freshman year there in Barnesville High School. And I continued there until I was a junior. And being as I was the oldest in the family, Dad needed me at home. So I never continued. I never graduated from high school. And then it was the war years. And I was about to be called into service. But being as I was the oldest one that could help my father, the rest were younger, then I got deferment. And they deferred me from, I think it was in the spring, I was supposed to leave for the service. I went to Fort Snelling that's where you had to go to get your physical. So we got on the bus, went to Fort Snelling, got the physical and passed it. And they put me in 1A and I was ready to go. And until Dad went to the draft board and he got a deferment until fall. And then that fall, then the crops were ready to be harvested, so he went to the draft board again to see if he could get another deferment. And this, while the harvest was on, is when the war ended. So I didn't get to see any of the fighting that was going on. But it was quite a challenge anyway for those that had to be at home. You know, there was all different kinds of rationing, tire rationing and gas rationing, and sugar was rationed and so on and so forth. And then you couldn't get parts, you know, the way you needed them. And you had to improvise, you had to fix. So that was during the World War II era.
Okay. You mentioned school several times. Let's go to grade school. You mentioned several schools that you went to. When you went to grade school, where did you go to school? What state were you in?
That was in South Dakota, the American Horse School in South Dakota. In Shannon County, South Dakota it was at the time. And that was in 31 when I started grade school.
Okay. Was this a one-room schoolhouse?
Just a one-room schoolhouse, yeah.
Okay. How did you get to school and how long did it take you?
Well, when I started school, it was about 2 miles. I mean, we had to walk. We'd done everything on foot.
Okay. How many teachers and students were in your school?
Well, there's only one teacher, and there's usually was about, I would say, between 20 and 30 at the time. One country school.
Okay. What was the composition of the school population? Was there a lot of different ethnicities?
No, when I started school in South Dakota, it was mainly German-Russian. There was quite a German-Russian settlement in that area, and the reason that the folks went there is because the land was so much cheaper, and they could buy land a lot cheaper, and they could raise crops, mainly winter wheat. That's what my dad liked to raise, and it was kind of what he was used to when he came from the old country, from Russia. He didn't care for the irrigation. I mean, it was hard work. I mean, he kind of always looked for dryland farming, but we never raised any crops. In South Dakota, we were there from 1930 until spring of 1937. He raised only one crop, and that was in 1935. And that was, he was constantly depending on the government for help, you know. There was, the government had different programs where they would give you the seed, and so you could try it again for another year. Well, it got to the point where you just couldn't try anymore. So that's when they pulled up stakes and left for Nebraska. there you could raise crops because of irrigation.
At your school, did the teacher treat students differently that were from different ethnic backgrounds?
No, they were good teachers. They treated people, students. They treated students alike.
Okay.
But they were more stern than what they are today.
What were some examples of the punishment?
Well, I remember when I started school there in South Dakota, we had a man teacher, and he was, the first thing he'd done when he addressed the class was he laid his stick on the side of his desk, and he said, anybody that doesn't want to learn anything and thinks that he knows more than what I do, he says, and wants to be unruly, he said, this is what I use. And it was a different type of teaching than what we see today.
Okay.
Teachers haven't got a chance, the way I see it.
What was your favorite memory about going to school there?
Being able to play ball. Softball. Yeah, we loved. And then on the way to school, I mean, to be able to go, back with other kids, walking along the road and, talking and communicating with one another. It was great.
Okay. What subjects were you taught in school?
Well, the main subjects: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Spelling and arithmetic was my best subject. History, I loved history, but the American history, I didn't care for ancient history.
And what was your least favorite subject?
Well, I would say history.
Okay. Did you have homework?
None. My homework was work when I got home.
Did you ever have to stay home from school so you could work?
Not in my younger years, but in high school years, I would have to stay home quite a bit. There's a lot of times I wouldn't get started until after Christmas, until the field work was all done and the harvest was all in. And
Okay. Could you tell us about some of your experiences in high school?
well, the experience that I had was I was always had makeup work. I finally told Dad, I said, when I approached my junior year, I said, Dad, if I'm going to have to go through this again, I'm not going to school. I'll go to the Army. Well, he said, don't look like you have much of a choice. The Army is right here. They want you. But I said, I just couldn't handle all the makeup, plus the classes from day to day, It was just too much. And it was no fun. Let's put it that way. But just to have the regular classes, and I could have attended school when school started, it would have been fun. Because I passed every grade, even though I had all the makeup to do, but I had to study hard.
How old were you when you started high school?
Well, I started high in fall of '39. I was 14.
And that was in Minnesota?
No, I started high school in Gearing High, Gearing, Nebraska. My folks moved away from there then in the next spring, in the spring of '40. That's when we moved to Barnesville, Minnesota.
Did you have to board in town when you went to either of these high schools?
No, I didn't. She was about 7 miles. We lived 7 miles southwest of Barnesville, and my father would, after the chores were done in the morning, we had to get up early and had chores to do, and always had livestock. And he would take us to school. He'd always, in fact, I was only one at the time that went to high school, and he'd drive me in, then he'd come and get me.
And what would he drive you to school in?
The car, the family car.
What type of classes did you take in high school?
Well, I took history, I took math, I didn't take algebra, I didn't like it. I took science, biology, which is biology, of course. I like biology and math.
What was the class size and the teacher-to-student ratio in your high schools?
Well, I would say there's, on the average, I think it would be around 30, 35 when I was going to high school, and both at Gearing and in Scottsbluff. I mean, in Barnesville.
Okay. What was the composition of the children in high school? Were they mainly Germans from Russia, or were they different ethnicities?
Well, it was kind of different for me, coming from an area where there was mostly Germans from Russia, and moving to Barnesville, and it was mostly Norwegian and Swedish. And they would come to school with their own Norwegian and Swedish brogue, and I was coming to school with my German-Russian brogue, and we'd gather around and we'd kind of listen to each other, and I was wondering where we came from. I know I had made the comment to one of my school buddies when I started Barnesville High that am I that different? I said, why are they always gathering around me and want to listen to me talk? Well, he said, you've got a different brogue. And I don't know, I think it was German ethnic brogue that I had, because when I started school, I had an awful time with the English language. We spoke German at home all the time, you know.
Did the teacher treat the students differently depending on their ethnicity?
No, they didn't, no.
What was the discipline like in high school?
Well, it certainly was different than what it is today. We didn't have drugs to contend with, for one thing. And students respected teachers. I think there's too much disrespect this day and age. I don't know why it is, but it's all around us.
In your high school experience, were the students generally well behaved then?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. At the time when I went to high school.
Okay, let's go from your high school to talk about your family a little bit. If you could you please tell me about your grandparents on your father's side?
I never got to know them. They left Diddle, Russia in 1906, and they came to this country in. They had to have sponsors to get to this country, and they had an oldest daughter that was already here. She was married, and and they were living in Deerfield, Kansas. So they sponsored them to come over. And my father was a single man. He wasn't married yet. And he had a younger brother that wasn't married. And the older siblings were daughters, and they were married, and they come to America a year ahead of time, and they're the ones that sponsored the old folks to come in. And their port of entry was Galveston, Texas. And from there they went by train to Deerfield, Kansas. And then they were there. It seemed like work was always easy to get, especially if you wanted to work hard and do the work that nobody else wanted to do. And the railroad was the number one job that was hard work at that time, and always could find work on the railroad. So they had jobs on the railroad there at the time, and they always had the desire to become farmers, because they were farmers when they come from the old country, and every chance they got, they'd want to acquire a farm, but the first thing that they done is when they left there, left Deerfield, Kansas, they went to Colorado. And this was, I think they were there until about 1911. And then my grandparents wanted to go back to the old country. And my father said, "No, I'm not going back. I'm not going back there. If I go back there, I'll be in the Russian army," because they were taking, and they were becoming that age. Well, he said, "I want to go back. I want to be buried where I was born." So the two boys that were single had to go back with them, and they promised that they'd build them a house, but they wouldn't stay there. They'd come back to America, which they did. They stayed there that summer and built them a new home, because when they left Russia, they had to sell everything. They didn't have anything. So they went back to their hometown in Untitled, Russia, and that's where they built them a home, and within that year, and then they came back into the country. But before they came back in, my dad hooked up with a nice young gal there, and he got married, and he brought her back to this country in America, and his brother came in with him, but he was single. So the three came in, and that was in 1912. They were married in Russia. My folks were in Little Russia. And their port of entry when they came in then was in Nova Scotia, Canada, because it was cheaper. For one thing, they found out it was cheaper to come in through Canada and then to come into the United States. So they came in through Nova Scotia was the port of entry, and then they went to down the St. Lawrence Seaway to Detroit, Michigan was their port of entry into the United States then, and then they went to Lincoln, Nebraska, because my mother had an uncle that had come in previous years and was working on the railroad. That was a big railroad hub at that time in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they worked on the railroad until they got enough money or they could go on further and pursue what they were looking for. So really, in 1913 is when they went to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and they worked in the sugar beet fields. and they were beet laborers. And in the wintertime, they worked in the sugar beet factory because the factories were spotted all over that valley there, Scottsbluff County. And you had plenty of work to do, I mean, in the sugar beet factories in the wintertime. So they done that for a couple of years, and then they rented renting farms until they left that area there again, and that's when they left in 1916 to Hardin, Montana. Then I've got a brother and a sister that's buried there in the Hardin Cemetery that died during the flu era, World War I. They died of diphtheria.
Could you tell us about your grandparents on your mother's side?
I never knew them. They never came to this country. They were in a village which was, I'd say, the way they said, was about 2 miles from the village that my father grew up in. And he never had a desire to come across that big ocean, my mother's dad. So I never got to know him.
Could you please tell me about any of your aunts and uncles?
Well, it seemed like we always had aunts and uncles, and we always were close to them, and it seemed like they were always close-knit families, and we knew of them all the time. I mean, it seemed like every Sunday, I mean, we'd be visiting one or the other, or they'd be visiting us.
Who was your favorite aunt or uncle?
Well, I don't know if I'd have a favorite one, but the one that wouldn't discipline so much would be my favorite. That varied. Whoever disciplined too much. I mean, the aunts and uncles were great at that. Yeah, they really like to shake their finger at you whenever you've done something wrong.
So then did you have a lot of cousins around?
Oh, yes, plenty of cousins around all the time. Oh, they all had big families, you know.
How often did you see these cousins and aunts and uncles?
Well, that usually on Sundays, usually from church on, and then after church get-togethers, you know. Yeah, quite often.
Did you have any large family gatherings besides after church at all? Ever?
Well, I think the families were large to begin with. Nobody had a big enough home to have large family gatherings, you know. But we were close knit. I mean, we were communicated all the time.
How did you stay in touch with one another?
Well, I think just, they didn't have telephones. They just drove to one. I can remember when they still had the horse and buggy days, you know. When I was living in Colorado, it was horse and buggy days yet then. That's how they traveled until the automobile come along, and then they weren't Amish. They were, whenever they had a chance to improve, they did it. Not that I've got anything against the Amish, but I mean, it's traditional, you know.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your extended family members?
Not really.
Okay.
Just that they were just as strict as my parents were.
All right. Speaking of your parents, you've told us a little bit about the journeys of your father. Could you tell us more about him as a person?
Well, he was a lot bigger than I am. He was a big, strong man. He was He was very stern. Whenever he'd shake his finger at you, you knew what he meant. And I think discipline is a great thing. I mean, after all, I mean, when you're growing up, I mean, if you're not disciplined, I mean, what's going to happen, you know? And these German Russians, they had discipline. And I think they had it right. Not that they abused you, but they warned you. You go ahead and you do that again, you know what you're going to get, you know, and you got a licking.
Okay. And he was born in Russia, correct?
My dad was born in Little Russia.
And what year was he born?
He was born in 1891. December the 3rd, 1891. My mother was born July 14th in 1892.
Okay. How did your father express his emotions, such as love or fear or anger?
Well, one thing I knew, I don't think he had any fear. I don't think, at least he didn't show it. Because, I mean, the way he moved around to different parts of the country and not be fearful as a 16-year-old to come across that big water, the ocean, and as a 16-year-old, I mean, he didn't show any fear to me for all my growing up years. And he was very stern and very religious in our upbringing.
Okay. Could you describe your relationship with your father?
Well, I was always with him. I mean, it seemed like I was the only one that could be with him because, you know, I had brothers. I had 3 brothers that had muscular dystrophy. And that was hard. I had 2 brothers that were older than I am, and then I had 1 brother that was younger. And I've got only 1 brother that's left, and he's 5 years younger than I am. Yeah, it was hard growing up with 3 brothers that were crippled up with muscular dystrophy.
You mentioned that your father wanted to be a farmer. Was that his main profession?
His father was farmer in Russia too, you know, and it seemed like that's most of them that came from that area of Russia was farmers.
Okay. How did your father cope with the hard times?
Well, I don't know. It just seemed like he coped with it. I don't see how I could have stood 7 years not raising a crop. And he had a big family too, you know. But we never went hungry. We always were self-sufficient. And we had big garden all the time. They'd done a lot of canning and put up preserves all for the winter. And they always had a dugout. That's the first thing that they made sure of. They had a dugout where they could put in their, if they didn't have basement in the home, well, then they would have a dugout out back. I remember we had, in South Dakota, we had a dugout. And we had our whole winter supply in that dugout.
What types of food, what crops would you put in the dugout?
Well, I tell you, the folks had, they raised a lot of melons for one thing, and they would, we ate watermelon all winter long because they preserved it in these big wooden barrels, the whole watermelon preserved. And it was good. It was good. I mean, but you had to be brought up with it. I tried it, and my children, they wouldn't eat it. They said, "Man, this watermelon is rotten." I said, "It's not rotten. It's preserved, just like pickles."
All right. When, where, and how did your father die?
Well, he died in his home in Barnesville. He had a massive heart attack. He was sitting and reading the paper just before supper, and he just keeled over, and that was the end of it. He was only 58 years old.
Okay. Let's switch over and talk about your mother. How did she express her emotions, such as fear, love, or anger?
Well, I think I got a little of hers. Her emotions came out in tears. That's how she expressed her anger and her emotions.
Okay. Could you describe your relationship with your mother?
It was close, real close. I was always at her side whenever she needed me.
And what was her profession?
Well, she had a housewife. That's the only profession that she knew.
And how did she cope during the hard times?
I don't know how she put up with it, but she did.
Okay. And when, where, and how did she die?
Well, she died, she was 94 years old. And she just died of old age. I mean, she did have sugar diabetes, and she got this in her later years. I think she was about 68 years old when she had come down with diabetes. But she had 15 children, and she lived to be 94 years old. There's 6 of us living today, of the siblings. I'm the third to the oldest that's living. I've got 2 sisters that are older. One is 88, one is 86, and I'm 83.
Who was the strict parent, your mother or your father?
My father. We could get by with things sometimes with Mom.
And how did they discipline you children?
My dad used a razor strap. He had a straight edge razor, and he always had a strap hanging where he shaved. Well, whenever he'd head for that strap, you knew you was coming. Well, what was coming? You knew you'd done something wrong. And that reminded you the next time. Hey, I better not do this. I know what I'm going to get. They were strict, very strict. And I think in the German Russians, I think they were kind of all that way. I mean, from my experience, most of them anyway, they were very strict and responsive whenever you done anything wrong, Try to correct it right away before it got out of hand.
Who influenced your life more, your mother or your father?
Well, I think they both did, really. I mean, I couldn't say one way or the other. They were both very strong-minded and seemed like, and they They wanted the best for their children.
How did your parents meet?
Well, that was when they were back, they were building their home for his parents when they went back to Russia with him. And they were in a village, him and his brother, and they was after work. They went to a parlor to have a beer, and then he met a young man from the nearest village, which was Kraska, Russia. And my dad had mentioned to him that he wanted to bring back to America a good German housewife. And he said, "Man, I've got the woman for you. My sister, that all she talks about is going to America." Well, he said, "I'd like to meet her." Well, he said, "I'll make arrangements." So he made arrangements and had my dad over for on a Sunday dinner, and they hit it off, and they got married in my dad's church where he was confirmed and baptized in Little Russia. That was a bigger church. The church in the village where my mother was growing up in was a lot smaller, so they had the wedding in my father's church where he went.
How long did they date before they were married?
I think it was love at first sight. I don't think there was much dating going on there. Hey, she's the one for me, and that's the way it went.
Okay. What type of things did your parents do during their pastime, during their free time?
Well, I would say it was mostly like visiting with relatives and friends, and well, I don't know if you'd call it free time, but anyway, it'd be like on Sundays. I mean, we always went to church on Sundays, and us kids would go to church. We'd have to go to Sunday school, and then when we grew up, we had to go to youth services, and it was kind of centered around the church.
Okay. Speaking of church, let's talk a little bit about that. How often did your family attend church?
It was every Sunday, and well, a lot of times during the week too, and they weren't too busy. I mean, they had services. They had prayer meetings, midweek prayer meetings that my folks attended, and they would a lot of times we would have to go along with them, and that would get so long sometimes, and you'd have to sit there, and it would get boring and tiresome. But we had to.
How long did church generally run for you?
How was that?
How long did church generally run on a Sunday?
Well, the church was no more than about an hour and 15 minutes. It was same as today.
Okay. What denomination were you raised?
Lutheran.
Any particular synod or?
Missouri Synod. I was starting. I started my catechism in German in Gary, Nebraska, and I had just started catechism when we moved from there to Minnesota, and it was in German. And then when I went to the church here, they had already quit the German catechism just the year before. Then I had to start my catechism all over again in English.
When you went to church, what were the seating arrangements like?
The women sat on one side and the men on the other. And the boys sat with the men and the girls with the mothers. That's the way it was. It didn't make any difference whether it was a congregational church or whether it was a Lutheran church or or whatever church you attended back in those days. That's the way it was.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you had confirmation in both German and English. Did you finally get through all your confirmation?
Oh, yes.
Did your family have a celebration for you after?
Oh, you bet.
Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, all I know is a big gathering, and you had all the aunts and uncles and everybody there that could come and were close enough, And it was a big celebration. Kids would all get together then and go out and play softball. Had a ball.
Were you able to question the religious teachings during your confirmation and during church?
It was open, yes, absolutely. I mean, you asked questions, and you discussed different things about religion and about religious practices and stuff.
Okay.
And then when I got married, I married a lady that, my present wife here, was also Lutheran.
Was German used during church services?
It was German when we left there. They still had German services in Gearing in 1939, and even in the spring of '40 when I was going to be confirmed, they had German services too, and German catechism. That's where I started.
When you moved to Minnesota, did they have German during their church services too?
No, they had quit it. They had quit the German services and the German catechism, and it was one reason was the war during World War II was going on at the time, and they just the church just kind of decided to quit the German services because we were at war with Germany, and they were afraid there were going to be repercussions from the government, so they kind of went by what it was in World War I. I mean, I remember my mother was telling me when they lived in Hardin, Montana, and the government come in and shut down the churches. I mean, you couldn't have German, that is German services. Well, our German people, they didn't know much English, so they held their services in homes then, which was okay. The government didn't say anything about it, but they didn't want you to have German services in the church. And I think that's the reason that in World War II that a lot of them quit with the German services.
Okay. Did you have a Sunday dinner after church?
Oh yes, a big dinner.
What was a typical meal served at this dinner?
It was always chicken noodle soup and fried chicken. That was traditional. That was every Sunday after church.
And a lot of your cousins and family would be there as well?
Oh, you bet.
How did your family respond and react towards death during that time? Like if their friends or other family died?
It was hard. Death is hard on anybody. But you worked through it, just like they have to today.
Could you describe a typical funeral service for us?
Well, I would say that there wasn't anything traditional about it. It was just the way funeral services are attended today, only they didn't have most of the most of the people that are in that die are the ones that like today. Now they have the undertaker takes care of it. Well, there wasn't no such thing when I was growing up. Never took them to an undertaker.
Who did you take them to?
They usually had somebody that would make the casket, usually a pine box, and then I remember when my brother died in South Dakota, it was just a pine box. My father went to Batesland, South Dakota, and there was a guy that made these caskets, and it was all out of wood. Bring them home, and they prepared them at home. I remember they prepared my brother at home, and that's what was, it makes it hard for a young one growing up to go through that.
Did you have a wake at your home then? Or...
No, it wasn't that way. It was all done at the church. The pallbearers were the ones that carried the casket into the church and out of the church and to the cemetery. And where today it's done by funeral homes and cremated, which that wasn't the case then. There was no cremation.
You've moved around several times during your youth. Could you please tell us about some of the houses that you grew up in?
Well, the one that sticks in my mind the most was the tar paper shack in South Dakota.
How many rooms did that place have?
2.
And where did you all sleep in the house?
Well, folks slept in one room, and there was a curtain between us, and the kids slept in the other one. And the kitchen was one end.
Okay. What was the furniture like in that house?
There wasn't a lot. It was just enough. Well, mainly we had, the thing that sticks out in my mind is the table. We always had a big, long bench. And we all sat behind, the kids sat in the bench. The younger children that were able to eat by themselves would sit on the bench.
How long did you live in that house?
7 years.
And how big was the family at that point?
Well, let's see, there was... 7 of us.
How did your family keep your houses warm in the winters and cool in the summers?
Well, there's a lot of houses in, I remember visiting different families that the folks would go and visit, and they lived in a sod house. I remember that in South Dakota when we lived there, and they were so nice and cool in the summer, and they were warm in the winter. But a dirt floor. All you done was if it got dusty, the floor got dusty, you just wetted it down so it wouldn't. But mainly it was wood. You couldn't afford anything else. Coal was expensive at that time and hard to get. They'd always have made sure that they had enough firewood on the place, and so that we'd have enough through the winter months. And my dad seemed like he was always, when in his spare time, was splitting wood or sawing wood, so we have enough firewood for the stove, big potbelly stove that warmed the whole house, just one central location.
What was your houses like in Gering and Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota, I'd say in Gering it was an old house, but it was a lot better than the tar paper shack that we lived in South Dakota. And then when we left Gering and went to Minnesota, it was better. It was a 2-story house, and it was built around the turn of the century, and most of them homes that were built then weren't insulated. It was hard to heat, and But I can remember we had these vents in the ceiling from downstairs, and we had the central heater in the center of the house, and it would heat the upstairs through the registers. And I think that was the main reason that there was 2-story houses at the time, too. Because if you're going to heat the upstairs, you have to carry your wood upstairs and carry the ashes down. And but most of the old houses were with the registers, so to each bedroom that the heat would come up, which was a great idea at the time. But now it's altogether different.
Whose job was it to make sure that the heat was always going through the house?
My dad. We'd shut down the register, and they didn't want the folks to hear what we were saying. Why, he'd yell up and say, "Open that up. It's going to get too cold up there." We'd have to open it up. Yeah.
How often did your family entertain guests in your houses?
Usually on weekends, on Sundays mainly.
What was it like when your parents entertained guests?
I think it was mainly reminiscing of the country that they came from the old country. You'd hear a lot of stories from there. Us kids would listen to them, and you just think, well, how could that be possible? What they all went through out there. It was hard enough here, but I mean, to think of some of the stories that were told, and I know they were true stories of the life struggles in Russia. That was the reason that they wanted to come to this country, where they had more freedom, and the way it was going when my folks left there was right after the Russian-Japanese War, and it killed so many of the Russian soldiers, and they needed more soldiers. But in the manifesto that Catherine the Great had with the German people, when she enticed them to leave Germany, she said that for 100 years there was that they didn't have to serve in any military. That enticed the Germans tremendously to leave Germany to go to Russia. And that was back in the 1760s, after the 7-Year War in Germany. They were sick of war, so they left. I mean, in droves. I mean, it didn't make any difference whether you were farmers or what you were. But when you got to Russia, they found out that the only reason that she enticed the German people there is because she wanted that vast territory settled to keep these raiders from coming in from the northern Asian countries and kill and maim people and burn their homes and everything. They didn't have enough population, and it was a good agricultural soil that she wanted it populated. So she enticed them to come there. there's a lot of them were dentists, a lot of them were doctors, but they soon learned how to be farmers because that's all there was.
Do you have any particular story that sticks out in your mind from any of those visits?
Well, it seemed like they had a shortage of pastors for one thing, and then he'd be going from one village to the next, and he had several villages that he'd have to. And one that really stuck out in my mind was that they were parishioners were waiting for the pastor to come to their village for that Sunday, and he never came, and they started looking for him, and here he had, they found the remains of his horses and his sleigh, and this is in the wintertime. Wolves were terrific, I guess, at that time, and he never made it. The wolves got him before he got there. And my mother tells me when she was a young girl that she remembers the reason they had shutters on their windows is to keep the wolves from looking in the window and wanting to get at them. In the wintertime, they'd get hungry, and they'd come from the forests and look for food. And these villages is where they could find animals. They'd attack animals in the corrals and horses, and they always had people with guns all night long, in the wintertime especially, to keep these wolves out because they would attack their livestock and kill them and eat them. That was terrible.
Okay. What language was spoken at your house?
German.
Were you allowed to speak English?
Oh yes, when we didn't want to talk German to them, we'd talk English. We did it mainly to get the folks to be able to speak it too.
How did they feel about speaking English?
Well, you talk English to them, they always want to talk German. I said, talk English so you learn it. Well, they learned it somewhat. My dad was better than my mother was because he loved to read history, and he was always reading, and he learned English just by reading. And by going on with his business, and farming and stuff. He had to meet with people in his country that spoke English, and he was better at it than my mom was. But today she died when she was 94 years old. She had broken English.
Did they encourage you to learn English well?
Oh yes, definitely. They wanted us to learn English.
Okay. Where did you go to the bathroom in these houses, such as like South Dakota? Did you have an outhouse, or is there a room in the house?
There was an outhouse.
Could you kind of describe it for us, how far it was from the house and that type of thing?
Well, when you were a child growing up, you thought, well, why in the world couldn't they have it right behind the house? No, they had it in the farthest part. I don't know why it was that way, but it was, I suppose, in the summertime to keep the flies and stuff away from the house. To keep the furthest away from the house, the better.
How often did you take baths in your youth?
Once a week. Yeah, in a galvanized tub. The girls first, then the boys. We always had to take a bath in a girl's water. We didn't like that.
Did your family make their own soap for the baths?
Yes, my mother made her own soap.
And how did you heat the water for your baths?
On the cook stove, and later years they had a stove, wood-burning stove that had a water reservoir on the side that the water stayed hot in that quite a long time, and then it would be just right for bathing, and then we'd use that. And then if it wasn't enough, why then you'd put some more on the stove to heat it on the top of the stove.
How many tubs of water did you go through? How many people had to share the water?
Well, I had more sisters than I had brothers, so we had to share the water with quite a few sisters. 6 of them. But they didn't get as dirty as we did.
How often were you supposed to brush your teeth?
Oh, we brushed our teeth pretty regular, yes, at least every night. And I never seen it. I never was to a dentist all my growing up years until I got married. Whenever we'd get a tooth that would have to come out, my dad would say, let me see once, how is that? He'd feel of it. It's like that. Well, here it is. That's how we got to the dentist. And my wife couldn't get over it when we were first married that they went to the dentist every year, and probably even every 6 months out of the year, but we never did. She couldn't get over it. And I still got my teeth. I don't have false teeth.
What was the reasoning for not going to the dentist?
Well, one reason was most of the time the transportation problem, because when we lived in South Dakota, we lived 45 miles from the nearest dentist. And then not alone that, but not enough money, too costly. So we were always advised to brush our teeth.
You mentioned earlier that you always had watermelons around. Did your mother have a garden?
Well, we said, yeah, she was the main one to, of course, before us kids were grown up, she always had a big garden, and she done a lot of canning and preserving. And I remember when we was living in South Dakota, we lived close to the Indian reservation, and where the reservation was, they had a lot of these wild berries that would grow, growing, and I remember going on a lot of these berry picking things to go and get enough berries so she could make preserves for the winter. And it was mostly choke cherries. But she could make good jelly out of it. It was good on pancakes, and mainly the German pancakes.
What's the German pancakes?
Well, it's mostly a lot of eggs. They called it pannekuchen, a pan kuchen. There was a lot of egg in it, I know, because we always had our own chickens and always had eggs.
What type of vegetables and fruits did your mother grow in her garden?
We had just about every vegetable that can grow in a garden, but they always made sure they had a lot of melons. That was one thing that it was a traditional thing that they brought over from Russia, I think, is that mainly to be able to have it year round. I mean, that's the only way they could preserve it. Otherwise they had a lot of other different kinds of melons, And most of the seed that they had was brought from over there, and they had a certain kind of a melon that was really hard to find here in this country. It was just a small, it didn't get very big, it was about this size, and it was a real pale green in color. That was the one that was suited best for that preserving.
Okay. Do you know how they were preserved? Do you know the method of preservation?
Well, they put, our folks never put anything else with it outside of just salt, just preserving it in salt, brine.
Okay.
Make sure that that the melons were submerged in the brine, and they'd put something on the top, and then they'd weight it down with a rock or something to make sure that the melon stayed underwater. And they would keep all winter. But the longer they kept, the more salty they got. So we try to eat them up fast.
Who usually prepared the meals for your family?
My mother. Yeah, my mother. And then when my older sisters grew up, they were a lot of help.
Did you or any of your brothers have to help in the kitchen at all?
No, I had older sisters that had done that. I had to help my mother with chores. She was the one that milked the cows. My dad never learned how to milk cows. He was very smart. Just hand milking. He always said, that's not a man's job, that's a woman's job. And I always was with my mother and helped her milk. And then when I remember I was 5 years old, I'd be sitting under a cow, and she'd always make sure I had the gentlest cow, and we never had a barn. I mean, she had those cows trained that she could just go out in the corral and call them, and then I always had a little bucket and a little grain in it, and I'd pour a little grain on the ground for them, and while they were eating it, we milked them. Right out in the corral, in the open corral, without even in a stanchion or anything, you know. Yeah, those days I remember. I used to go out with a syrup can, a gallon can, and milk, help my mother milk. She on one side a lot of times, and her on the other.
You mentioned earlier that you had a big bench that all the kids sat on at the dinner table. Were there ever assigned seatings? Did you have to sit in a particular spot at the dinner table?
No.
And were you allowed to talk at the dinner table?
Not too much. That was a place to eat. But first of all, before we could eat, we always waited for Pa to say grace in German, and we had to repeat it too. You know, we had to say grace with him.
Do you still remember the prayer?
Ja?
Would you care to recite it for us?
Komm, Herr Jesus, sei unser Gast. Segne, was du uns beschert hast. Do you understand it?
No. What does that mean in English?
Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest, and let this food to us be blessed.
What types of food did you usually eat at the table?
Well, they always had meat, and their own preserved meat. My dad was good at preserving meat, and we always had butchered. They usually done their butchering in the fall, and they always made always butchered beef and hog at the same time, and then they'd make this German sausage. That was great, that German sausage. We had a lot of that. And of course, he would you take the hams and the bacons and stuff. He would preserve it in a brine, and then when it was preserved with a smoke salt, and then they would slice it and put it in a crock, and the lard that would be rendered from it. They poured that right back in the crock, and it sealed up the meat, and it preserved it for a long time. I mean, I remember we had a 10-gallon crock, and when they'd butcher, that would be full of meat. Oh, that was good for breakfast. It was like bacon, you know. That was our bacon. And then the hams, he'd preserve them, and we'd usually have them for holidays like Christmas, and that's why they butchered in the fall. They'd have their hams and the bacons and stuff like it for Christmas and New Year's. I know ham was great for New Year's, always a traditional thing for us.
Okay. You mentioned that you guys made sausage. Do you remember, or did you have to help with making sausage?
Oh, yeah.
Could you describe the process for us?
Well, from start to finish, the first thing we had to do was, I remember my mother, she'd always have to be there in the job when the butchering was done, and I was always beside her and helping her in my earlier years, and she would have to clean the intestines. They used the intestines and cleaned them, mainly from hogs, and they were the best for making sausages because they weren't as heavy and as thick and as hard to clean. So she would she would hold and I'd have to pour the water in to clean out, and then we'd lay it in salt water. Then when the butchering was done, she would make the cleaning process of the intestines before you'd make the sausage. The intestines had to be prepared, and they would I remember she'd have a wooden board, and she would scrape and scrape and scrape and scrape until they were just almost paper thin. You could hold them up to the light, and you'd be like looking through a window almost. I mean, that's how thin they would be. And when I was on the job of turning the crank with the sausage stuffer, and she'd be on the other end and handling that. One of my sisters would be tying them shut. And when the sausage was made, Dad had a smokehouse where he smoked his own sausage, and smoked it in the smokehouse. And a lot of times it would hang there until almost spring. I mean, that's where it kept, it was kept frozen through the winter. We had sausage a lot.
Did you guys ever make blood sausage?
Oh, no. Folks didn't like it. No, that's one thing I wasn't accustomed to. Was never brought up with it.
Okay. What were some of your favorite meals?
Sausage.
What types of dishes would they make with the sausage?
Well, they make soup out of it a lot of times. They raised a lot of cabbage, and they made their own sauerkraut. We had sauerkraut in these big crocks, and they always had plenty of sauerkraut, seemed like. And she would take this sausage and put it in small slices, and make soup out of. Put this into the sauerkraut and potatoes. Oh, that was a full meal. That was good. And then there's a lot of times she would make potatoes and dumplings, and potatoes and noodle, potatoes and noodles, you know. Yeah, that was, and a lot of times it was a whole meal, you know. And then she'd have bits of bacon in it for meat, right in the potatoes and noodles. That was great.
Okay. Do you remember how they made the sauerkraut?
Yes, I made it myself here, just since I've been living in here. I had a bunch of cabbage back here, and I had a crock full of it. It lasted me about 2 years, I think. No, the only thing they used was salt, but you have to have a shredder. You set the shredder over a big pan, and then you cut your head of cabbage in pieces that you can handle, and while you're putting it over the shredder, and then you take and I forget what the percentage is of salt that you put according to you weigh the cabbage, and then the percentage of salt according to what the weight of the cabbage is, and then you put this in. You don't have to add water. You just put it into the thing and you stomp it down good. By the time you've got it full of cabbage, you've got the water to the top. That's in the head of cabbage, you know. And then you weight it down with a lid or something, and then I always just use a stone or rock or something to put on there to keep, so that just like you would do the melons, just submerged in the brine. And then you leave it there for about a week. You start testing it the way you like it. You don't want it too salty, but it gets to the taste that you want in it. Then you put it in jars, seal it up, just like, and then I don't know, they bland it or something a little bit, and then seal it up, and it lasts for years. I had some here that was 3 years old from that, when I made here.
Okay. Did you have any least favorite meals?
No, I didn't. I don't know. I think it's because we were always hungry. I mean, they all tasted good.
Besides the sausage and the sauerkraut and the melons, were there any other traditional German dishes that you had?
Well, they called rivel soup. Rivel soup is just made of eggs and flour, and it's run over a colander and made into little rivels, you know, and we'd have it in milks, and we'd have it in a broth, like chicken broth, you know, instead of chicken noodle soup. A lot of times we'd have chicken and rivel soup. You'd have it in with the chicken broth, or you'd have it with milk even. To this day, my wife makes a lot of times with rivels or with noodles, with milk or with chicken broth, you know.
Okay.
That's a full meal. That's all you need.
Did your family ever make ice cream?
Oh, yes, that was a traditional thing. But 4th of July, that's the only time we got ice cream.
And do you remember how it was made?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do.
Would you like to share with us how you made it?
Well, my dad always had a place where he had in the dugout. He had a hole, and he'd gather the ice. I don't know where he'd get it, but he got it in chunks. It must be from a place where they made it. I don't know, but in town he'd come home with it, and he'd put it there, and then he'd put sawdust over the top of it, and cover it up real good, and that would practically last all winter. And we would use that ice to put in the ice cream maker, Well, you had the ice around it, and then you had the container that went down the middle, and you put your ingredients in there, and you kept turning that. And then as the ice would melt around there, you just kept turning that. And pretty soon when it got real thick, then you knew you had ice cream. When you couldn't hardly turn it anymore. And we've done the same thing with butter.
Okay. What type of ingredients did you put in your ice cream?
Well, I know vanilla was one ingredient. And I think it was eggs and cream. That's the only ingredients that I know.
Okay. What was your family's attitude towards alcohol?
Well, I know my mother was deathly against alcohol because she seen so much of it from the country that she lived in. There was so many of them that had a lot of too much alcohol, and there was always trouble in the family and stuff like that, and they didn't really care for it.
Okay. Did your family ever make their own root beer?
Yes, they did. They did make home brew a lot of times too. I mean, their own beer and root beer too.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit about making root beer or just regular beer?
Well, I was quite small when they were doing it. I don't recall how they made it. All I know is that they put it in a big crock. I know that they made some home brew too once in a while, and they just kind of more or less like when they'd have company or something, Dad would take him down to the cellar or somewhere, and they'd have a drink or two, and yeah, that beer seems like was the main drink if there was any. Because most of them made their own. Yeah.
All right, let's move from food over to clothing a little bit. What types of clothes were common when you were growing up?
Well, I know we had felt boots. I can remember wearing felt boots when I was a kid. That was the warmest thing that you could ever put on your feet. I mean, for the winter. And then we had mostly caps that were lined with fur. I remember they were fur lined. The ear lappers were fur lined, and big heavy coats. I remember they were so heavy. By the time you got done walking 2 miles to school, your shoulders ached. It isn't the light clothes that we wear nowadays. The man-made clothes, mostly wool.
And what type of clothes did your mother and sisters wear?
Well, they always wore hats, I know. I mean, that was a traditional thing. And coats, like for winter wear, they would wear real heavy coats. A lot of times, I remember my mother had a coat that this was fur, had a cuff around here that was fur, and the collar was fur. And the lining was kind of like fur line. And the material outside, I don't know what kind of material it was, but it was like a velvet type of, and mostly dark colors, black or brown.
Okay. Did they generally wear dresses and the men wore jeans or overalls?
You mean for dress or for work?
For work.
Women, they never wore jeans. I can't remember. The only time they wore jeans is when they were out in the field working with the men. Then they wore the overalls. But, I mean, in the house, that was dress. Dress was the wear. And the men always wore the bib overalls. You very seldom seen any man walk around with just the overall up to here. Bib was the main dress.
What about when you went to church or to town? What would
Always dress up. Always dress up. Except when you go to town on business, like if you're going to an elevator or going to a feed store or going, on business, then it wasn't traditional to be dressed up, just overall.
Okay. Were most of your clothes store-bought or handmade?
No, they were store-bought, but when we got holes in them, they were patched. Nowadays, they like them with holes in. But when I had to go to school and I had a hole in my knees, I wouldn't wear it. I'd cry. I didn't want to wear it to school with a hole in it. And now they want a hole in it.
Would you be teased at school if you had clothes with holes in them on?
No, because it seemed like back in them days, everybody was alike. Everybody wore patched. Nobody liked to see their knees showing through, everybody wore patched, so it was everybody. Everybody was alike then. Everybody was poor, and you knew it. But being poor, we never went hungry. And it's because they were self-sufficient. They always had their own food right on the place. Made their own food. That would be real hard if we had famine in this country today. For people that don't know how to prepare food, don't know how to raise it. There's a lot of them don't even know how to raise a garden. What would happen if all of a sudden we didn't have stuff trucked in from China or from all that? Look at the things that's being trucked into this country. That's not even being grown here anymore. What would people do if all of a sudden nothing was coming in from these other countries? We'd have mass starvation here. That's what happened in Russia. That when my grandparents went back, starvation hit that country because of the government, the way the government done everything. There was no freedom of anything. Everything was government controlled everything. And they come and they took away everything. If they suspicioned anything of you at all, they took everything away from you. You had nothing. My grandparents starved to death. And I've got letters here to prove it, that they would write to my folks. Some of the letters were horrible. They were all in German, of course, and it's mostly written in Gothic German, and that's the German that I never learned to read. I can read German if it's written in Latin letters, but I had them translated. You wouldn't believe what they had to go through. It was we in this free country of ours can't imagine what a dictatorship and what communism done to that country. And you can see it today compared to this country. And you've seen it in Bosnia. You see now what's going on in Iraq. It's all because of dictatorship. Pulling all the money that our people are slaving for, and then they don't give them nothing that they can help themselves with. That's why we're going to be fighting that war over there for 10 years, because of the fact that he controlled them. They had no way of being able to help themselves on anything. It's going to be a long time before that country is a democratic nation or a self-sufficient nation, even with all the oil they've got there. They can't seem to get it to work. The minute we move out of there, who's going to move in? All these terrorists that are trying their best to keep us out of there. We have a lot of problems in this country, but we've still got the best country in the world.
Okay. You mentioned earlier you patched a lot of your clothes. Did you have to wear hand-me-down clothes?
Not a lot, because all my older siblings were sisters.
Did anyone in your family sew or embroider or quilt?
My mother done a lot of sewing. Quilts, most of the quilts that were made, homemade quilts and stuff. They'd get together and at a church and have quilting parties, and they'd make quilts and they'd give them to the one that needed them the worst, that poorest families would get them. And
Where did they get the supplies for the quilting?
all the yarn and everything, it was all bought.
How often did you get new shoes?
Well, those were a lot of times hand-me-downs, a lot of times from cousins. During the poorest years that I can recall, I had a lot of shoes that were hand-me-downs, even some clothes.
Okay. When did your family get electricity?
Well, there was different times. You take like when they lived in Nebraska, they had electricity there for a long time before we even had it in Minnesota. When we moved to Minnesota, we had first got electricity on the farm in 1941 at Barnesville here in Minnesota when we moved from Nebraska. But we had electricity there.
How did this change your life?
Boy, it's like going from night to day. I remember you'd sit at an oil lamp and try to do homework or try to do any reading of any kind. You had to sit right by the lamp to try to read. That was always just like a difference of day and night, Of course, my folks say in the later years, when they could afford it, they had a gas lantern, one that you put gas in, but boy, they were dangerous. You'd put the gas in, and then you'd pump them up, and the air would force the gas out into a mantle. We usually had two mantles, and boy, that was a bright light. But the reason that a lot of people didn't go for them is because they were dangerous. They a lot of times would explode for some reason or another. I just don't know. Or they'd get a leak where you pump the air in. Sometimes it would leak there, and the gas would flame out. Before you knew it, why, everything could be on fire. But when they come out with the Aladdin lamp, that was the safest. It was kerosene burning, and it was a mantle, and that was a lot brighter than just a wick type of lamp, Like the one that's sitting up there is a wick type.
Okay. You mentioned eating hams for Christmas and ice cream for for 4th of July. I was wondering if we could talk about holidays for a little bit. And what was your favorite holiday?
Christmas.
Why was it your favorite?
Because we did get some things that we usually didn't get through the year. Like oranges and apples and candy and presents. They were quite traditional with Christmas. I mean, that's when we loved when Christmas come around, and New Year's too.
Okay. What type of presents would you get for Christmas?
No toys. It was mainly you'd get new clothes, you know. Oh, it was great to get new clothes, you know. You'd get away from patch clothes for a while.
Did your family celebrate Christmas Eve?
Mm-hmm.
What was a typical Christmas Eve like for you?
Well, they usually went to church. I don't know, it seemed like in my younger life it was mostly centered around the church.
Okay. Did your family celebrate Easter?
Oh, yes.
What was a typical Easter like for you?
Well, we had we'd wake up in the morning and we'd look for our baskets. That was one traditional thing, I guess. Mom would always take eggs and would dye them, you know, and she'd have a few candies like eggs and an orange or an apple, you know. It was a treat.
Did you have a big dinner celebration as well?
Yes, a big ham dinner.
And was this with just your immediate family, or did you have your extended family as well?
No, it'd usually be just immediate family on Easter Sundays because it seemed like everybody was with their own families. That was kind of the traditional thing in me growing up in those years.
Okay. You mentioned you got ice cream on the 4th of July. Besides that, what else was a typical 4th of July like for you?
Well, visiting. A lot of times we'd have a lot of relatives or friends or neighbors that would come over, you know, and visit, and we very seldom ever had any firecrackers or anything like that. We just play ball, softball. We loved to play ball. Then we'd have other games like high Andy over and different ones where you'd be on one side of the house and another group would be on the other side of the house. And have you acquainted with that?
No.
I can't even remember how it went anymore. It was like two teams, you know, playing against each other. That was a lot of fun too. And there was other games too, but I can't just recall. We improvised. We always had games that we played. I remember we played marbles a lot, and the boys would, you know, and we'd get a game going with the marbles, and whoever could get the marbles out of a certain circle and whatever you could get out of there with your shooter, well, you could keep. A lot of times I'd go home without a marble, and sometimes I'd go home with a whole pocket full of them. Yeah, I loved that marble game. I'd come home with a pocket full of marbles, and my dad would say, "Where'd you get them?" He always afraid that I was stealing, you know. That's one thing they were against, boy, to steal something that didn't belong to you.
You mentioned you played softball a lot. Was this ever an organized? Did you ever play organized softball, or was this always just a neighborhood?
No, we had through schools too. We played a lot of. In fact, I was great in track. I remember when I was in my later grade years, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I was always in track and in Scottsbluff County, and was living at Gearing at the time, and that was we would have these track meets and stuff, and we'd go to them. And I was great in what do you call it, where like a team runs around the track, and you hand. Is that still going today?
Oh, the relay?
Yeah.
Relays?
Yeah, I was great. I was always in a relay, and I was in 25-yard dash, 50-yard dash, 100-yard dash, and I was great in broad jump. I always come home with blue ribbons or purple ribbons in broad jump, and 50-yard dash. Them are two favorites.
When did you practice for these sports?
When we're doing chores a lot of times. But we didn't dare let Dad catch us. You could play all you wanted if you had your chores done, but when you were playing and you weren't doing your chores and you weren't finished with your chores yet, then you caught heck.
Okay.
To them, there was a time for work and there was a time for play. That's the way they always put it to us.